In this section for History 370 Modern East Asia, Section 7, we will be examining how Japan is going to move from democracy to militarism. Our objectives for this section are to understand the nature of Japanese democracy, to understand why Japanese people were increasingly attracted to militarism as a solution to Japan's problems, and then understand why democracy is going to fall to militarism. Thus far, we have been looking at Japan as a kind of success story. Right? Poor China will fall apart, Korea will become a colony to Japan, but Japan itself is able to maintain its independence. And while I think we can be rightfully critical of its imperialism in Korea, considering that this was the kind of norm during this time period, we cannot, I think, single out Japan for special criticism. Right? Japan was acting in many ways like Western empires were acting. So while I think we can be critical of Japan for that, I don't think we can be emphasizing that in the sense that it was like the Japanese were the only ones doing that. So in one sense, we start this section with Japan doing very well. And we're going to end with problems that are going to lead to war and to the eventual occupation of Japan by a foreign power, which was what the whole Meiji Restoration was meant to avoid. Right? Remember, Japan had started off as a relatively weak country that was afraid of being colonized by these powerful Western empires, and through the Meiji Restoration had undertaken these massive reforms that made it so powerful that it not only maintained its independence, but built its own empire. And the problem is we're going to see, in a sense, by overreaching and by the rise of militarism, Japan will lose that empire and suffer foreign occupation. That's kind of a preview. We'll get to that, but I want to emphasize why this is so important. And what's especially shocking is, in many ways, things look pretty good for Japan, right? And we need to look at this from the perspective of Japanese people, right? If you were one of those Japanese people who was, say, born in the 1830s or 40s, you would have been able to take an active role in the Meiji Restoration of 1868. And you would have a lot to be confident about. You would have a lot to be proud of, right? Japan had maintained its independence when other countries were losing theirs. Your country had fought and won two major wars, right? Japan will defeat China in the Sino-Japanese War, making Japan the leading power in Asia. And then Japan will defeat the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War, which emphasizes and shows to the world that Japan really has made it, that they are able to stand up to a white power and win. So you can be confident. You can say, we're doing awesome. And also it was understood that what made this possible was the tremendous economic development, the industrialization that Japan had carried out. So in many ways, Japan had carried out the dream of a rich country, strong army, which was the guiding principle for the forces of the Meiji Restoration. Based on this foundation of rich country, strong army, Japan also had a growing empire. Japan will control what are called the Ryukyu Islands. You've probably heard of Okinawa. That's the major island in that group. As we've discussed before, Japan will gain a hold of Taiwan and Korea, as well as the Kwantung Peninsula, also called the Liaodong Peninsula. It gets complicated, but it controls that little bit of China to the west of Korea. So you can imagine if you were those people born in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s who lived, perhaps participated in the Meiji Restoration, and have now are becoming not depending on what decade you're born, not terribly old, but old enough that you can look back and say, hey, we did a great job, right? We did something that no one really believed could happen. We did it. And not only will those older people have a sense of confidence, imagine that you were someone who was born in 1868, right? You may remember some of the weakness that your country faced, but not that much of it. And you would not have that feeling of fear of the West that Japanese living in 1853 would have had, right? If you were there in 1853-54 when Commodore Perry, the American naval commander, comes in and forces Japan to open its doors, right? That was something that scared a lot of Japanese, even as it made them angry. If you're part of this new generation who's coming of age in the later 19th and into the early 20th century, and that will lead Japan, especially in the 10s, 20s, and 30s, you have a lot more confidence than even those older people, because you do not remember Japan's comparative weakness to the West. You only know about the victories. So we have to keep in mind that as we move forward, we're going to have this increasing generational shift, right? The previous generation who lived through the Meiji Restoration, they can be proud. They have a lot to look back at and feel confident about. But this younger group of people, they'll be even more confident because they don't remember that weakness. And they're going to be more willing to demand that the West take them seriously. They're not going to treat the West with the same deference that their elders did. And Japan had, in a sense, thrown its lot in on the right side. Remember, it's looking particularly at Britain as someone to imitate. Japan, remember, has an alliance with Britain. And so what this means is that during World War I, Japan will choose the right side, the Allied side, the side that wins. And this is important because, in a sense, what we're going to be talking about a bit is to get a sense of how Japan would become a country that originally allied with Britain against Germany to the kind of country that will be more sympathetic to Germany and ally with the Nazis, right? The Japanese choose the right side in World War I. They choose the wrong side in World War II. Part of the next few sections we're going to be looking at in this class are to try and understand how Japan became a kind of country that would do that. Now, during World War I, Japan is going to seize the German-controlled parts of China, right? Remember, we talked about Qingdao. We'll also seize some other areas in the Pacific, but our major focus is how Japan is going to seize German-controlled parts of China. During World War I, and we'll talk more about this later, Japan will also expand its power in China. The Europeans are busy with the war, creating a kind of power vacuum, and Japan will take advantage of that. And Japan's industrial output will basically more than quadruple, from 1.4 billion yen to 6.8 billion yen. So its industry is really booming because Europeans are fighting each other. They don't have as many people to work in the factories. They need to buy stuff so they can fight with each other. Why not buy from Japan? Because of this increase in industrial output, there's going to be a need for more workers, so wages will go up. And merchants and industrialists who are positioned to take advantage of this industrial development are going to become richer, and you're going to have the rise of a new class of wealthy people whose wealth comes from the increasing industrialization of Japan. So again, things seem to be going really well for Japan in many ways, right? Japan is a success story. Japanese institutions seem strong. The Japanese economy seems strong. Its diplomacy is strong. Things are going really, really well, right? Things are going really well. Alas, as a historian, I now have to say, but here's the problem, right? Obviously, there has to be a reason why Japan is going to turn away from these things that made it such a success. And so what we have to understand, and this is one thing that makes this section tricky, is that while there's many things Japanese people can be proud of during this time period, many things that show national strength, there are also problems. And there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of anxiety. So in one sense, you have this kind of, in Japanese society, this kind of dual feeling. On one side, you have Japanese people confident and proud of all they have done, but afraid that somehow all that good work will be undone and that something terrible is going to happen to Japan, right? So you have this confidence of past accomplishments, but fear that Japan might come undone somehow, that all these accomplishments might be destroyed. So let me give you one example. In 1911, there was a plot arranged by anarchists and socialists to kill the Meiji Emperor, right? There was an actual plot to kill the Meiji Emperor. What was particularly disturbing to people, if you look at that image there, which shows the various people who participated in the plot, on the far left is a woman. In my modern Japanese class, we talk a lot about her. Her name was Kano Sugako, but she was part of this plot to kill the emperor, and so was executed. And what's striking is she wrote in her prison journal that she didn't think that the emperor was a bad person, right? She didn't think the Meiji emperor was a bad person, but she thought the whole emperor system was bad. that it was rotten, that the emperor system and the Japanese state, economy, and society that was centered around the emperor. And remember, the emperor was key to Japan's success, right? The emperor was a symbol around which Japanese people could unify around. The emperor was a touchstone of what it meant to be Japanese, right? You could have all these changes, all these transformations in Japanese society, but we know we're fundamentally still Japanese and we can change because, hey, there's the emperor. He is our connection to our ancient past and our identity, and he's still there. Here you have people saying we don't like the emperor or the system built around him, right? So there's Japanese people who are questioning the whole system. Like I said, a lot of them are anarchists, a lot of them are socialists, and a lot of them will be communists later on. Though in this particular situation, it was anarchists and socialists. The communists will become more important later after the Russian Revolution. But this kind of freaks people out, right? A lot of Japanese are really shocked at this, right? They feel confident because things are going so well. And then you've got this group of people who are not happy with how things are going and hate the system so much that they're willing to kill the emperor and to risk their lives and ultimately to die to try and carry out this assassination. Though, like I said, they never even make the attempt. The plot is found out and they're executed before they can even try. There are going to be other causes for anxiety. In 1912, the Meiji emperor will die. He dies of natural causes, not from an assassination attempt or anything like that. He's just an older man. He dies. And, well, that's to be expected, right? We shouldn't be surprised that people die, right? He was, like I said, an older man. For many Japanese people, he was the only emperor they had known, right? For many Japanese people, he was the only emperor they had known. So his death was, in a sense, traumatic, right? There was this kind of constancy in Japanese politics and Japanese society, and that wasn't just the emperor system, but this particular emperor himself, who was a popular emperor. And he dies, and that's a concern. The emperor who will succeed him is called the Taisho emperor. He's pictured there on the right. He's a fairly young man, so there's hopes about him. But he will ascend and become the next emperor, and he's the Meiji emperor's son, so it's a normal succession, no problems there. But remember, that's the same year that the Qing emperor, the last Qing emperor, will be forced to abdicate, and the Chinese revolutionaries will establish the Republic of China, getting rid of that imperial system. So that's one less emperor in the world. So when you combine that with the plot to assassinate the Meiji emperor the previous year, that could kind of make the Japanese a little nervous, right? Here we actually have an emperor and the whole imperial system being overthrown in our neighbor China. And there are Japanese people who would like to have our emperor and our emperor system overthrown. So this creates a sense of anxiety. I say many Japanese people are very proud of the emperor system. They see their success as coming from the emperor system. They don't want any threat to that, but there seems to be a growing threat. Then in 1917, during World War I, you have the Russian Revolution, in which the Tsar will be overthrown and later killed, and this will lead to a new communist government, which of course is not an imperial system. In 1918, you will have the end of World War I, which will involve the Emperor of Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm II, abdicating. And by the way, if you're not familiar with the word abdication, it just is a special word that's used when a monarch resigns. When a monarch gives up office, that's called abdication. That same year, the Austro-Hungarian emperor will abdicate and his empire will be divided. And also the Ottoman Empire will fall and the Sultan will lose his position. So in 1918, you have three empires fall apart and their emperors abdicate, right? So if we start off things between 1911 and 1918, we have the Qing Emperor, that's one. We have the Kaiser Wilhelm, German Emperor, that's two. The Austro-Hungarian Emperor, that's three. The Ottoman Emperor, that's four. And of course, the Tsar, that's five. Between 1911 and 1918, you have five less emperors in the world. That makes the Japanese nervous. Right? That makes the Japanese nervous. This seems to be the way the world is heading. How can we preserve our system in such a situation? And what makes this particularly disturbing, is in 1919, the Taisho emperor is unable to perform his official duties. He's not able to act in an official capacity as emperor. It's not clear what was wrong, but there was something wrong mentally with the Japanese emperor. It's not clear what it was, but he had particular health deficiencies, mentally and physically, but mostly mental, that made him unable to perform his official duties. So his son, Hirohito, who will be the Japanese emperor who will help lead Japan into war, is going to be made regent in 1921. If you're not familiar with the term regent, regent is a person who rules for an emperor when the emperor is not able to rule himself. Typically, and I say himself because in this time period, Japanese emperors have to be men. In the ancient past, there were Japanese emperors who were not men, that they were empresses. But in the modern period, all Japanese emperors are men. Usually, this was done when the emperor died and his son was young. So you would have an older person act as the regent to help the child learn how to be an emperor and so forth. But it was very bizarre to have a son do this for his father because his father had mental and physical problems. So you can imagine this, right? We have two things kind of going on here. Emperors are disappearing. There's less and less emperors in the world, right? There's less and less emperors in the world. There are Japanese people who want to get rid of the emperors, and we have an emperor that can't do his job, right? We have an emperor that can't do his job. If the Meiji emperor was still around, I mean, that guy knew what he was doing. He was a smart guy. He was popular. Maybe he could deal with this situation, but we got an emperor who can't do his job, and his son has to take over for him. So again, there's a lot of anxiety. I have thus been focusing on the government's perspective, but we need to understand that there are other problems in Japan, and these are key to understanding why there's going to be a shift to militarism. And these problems we also need to understand as the causes behind some of the anxiety that you have among government leaders and among the elites about what's happening to the emperor system, to the form of government Japan has. So we've got these problems, right? One is agricultural. After the Meiji Restoration, you have an increase in new kinds of technology, new farming techniques coming into Japan, and so agricultural productivity will go up. What I mean by that is that farmers are able to grow more and more food with the same amount of land and labor, right? Productivity goes up. Farmers are able to grow more food per farmer. That's great. Population's going up. We need more efficient farming. And that also theoretically can help farmers become wealthier, right? As a farmer's agricultural productivity goes up, that farmer has more crops to sell. So that's good. But by the 1920s, it stops increasing and it plateaus, right? It stops increasing and it plateaus. And in part because things are not going as well for farmers, their wealth is not increasing, it's becoming increasingly easy for them to lose their land, right? It's going to become increasingly easy for farmers to lose their land. Farmers have to mortgage land in order, for example, to invest in modern equipment and things like that. Farmers are often in debt. If they can't pay their debts and the land was used as collateral, their land can be taken from them. And it's not just farmers who are having difficulties. There will also be an economic bust after World War I. Right? World War I led to a great expansion in Japanese labor and industrial output and things like that. But after the war, the Europeans were not killing each other anymore. The men who survived the war and women were going back to work, and they were going to compete with the Japanese now. So Japan is going to have to face more competition. That's going to lead to a post-boom bust, right? So the Japanese economy will face some problems after World War I, particularly rising unemployment and plateauing or even decreasing wages for workers. So one reason why you're going to have an increasing interest in things like anarchism, socialism, and communism, all isms that want to get rid of the emperor and the emperor system, is because of these economic problems, right? There's going to be this increasing economic problems in the 1920s in Japan, that is going to lead to growing support for things like anarchism, socialism, and later communism. And communism really freaks out the Japanese, since the communists actually led a successful revolution in Russia and overthrew an emperor and an emperor system. There will also be a growth in unions and in strikes during this time period. Japanese workers, even if they don't become socialists, will attempt to, through collective bargaining and strikes, improve their situation. Right? So we can tell that the workers are not always happy, right? They want to increase wages and things like that. And oftentimes, the army will be asked to maintain order. The army will be called in to put down strikes. And so many Japanese people will start to see the army not as the heroes who won the Sino and Russo-Japanese War, but as villains who are preventing the working and the agricultural classes from getting their just due. Right? The army, for many Japanese during this period, is going to move from a center of prestige to a villain that is coming down hard on Japanese people who are trying to improve their situation. What is remarkable is that Japan tries to deal with these problems not through decreasing democracy, but through expanding democracy. Right? So in the late 1910s and into the 1920s, Japan will not deal with these problems, with these fears, through simply repression. There will be some of that, but through expanding democracy. And I think one of the best examples of that we can see in the case of a man named Hara Kei. Now, Japan was a constitutional monarchy, so in a sense, the chief executive office was the prime minister. Japan is going to have a system very similar to that of Great Britain. So they have a prime minister named Hara Kei, who comes into power in 1918. He was remarkable and reveals the expansion of democracy in several ways. First of all, he was a commoner. Previously, prime ministers usually had some kind of title, aristocratic title. Now, this doesn't mean that they were related to the royal family, to the imperial family, but they were people who had been given some kind of title and basically become members of the aristocracy by the royal family. So, for example, Ito Hirobumi was a marquis at first and then later became a prince. Even though he wasn't related to the royal family, these were titles that were bequeathed upon him. And when he became prime minister, he held those titles. Hara Kei had no title. Hara Kei had no title. He was a commoner. He was also a civilian. There were prime ministers who held the office, but that had been soldiers in the past, but Hara Kei was not a soldier. So he was a commoner, he was a civilian, and his power actually came from him being the head of a political party. Right? So his power comes from him being head of a political party. He is an aristocrat, he's not a general, he is someone who has popular support. Now, at this time period, only a couple percent of Japanese people could vote, not that many, but he had popular support among this relatively broad group of people when you compare it to generals or something like that, right? He had popular support among this limited electorate. And he's able to form then the first effective, stable party government in which most of the positions in the cabinet, and of course he himself, will be held by people who have power from the fact that they are members of a political party that enjoys popular support. They're there because people voted for them. So that is an example of an expansion of democracy. Now, in some ways, this did a lot of good. This helped to stabilize a difficult situation. But at the same time, there's a kind of foreshadowing here, because Hara will only be prime minister until 1921. You'll notice that that's the year he dies, and he dies because someone killed him. Hara Kei will be assassinated because he wanted basically to reduce the military's budget. Right, in order to try and deal with the difficult economic situation Japan faced, he wanted to decrease the military's budget. He wanted to have arms restrictions. And this is a time period after World War I when there was this worldwide movement to try and limit the production of arms, to limit especially the development of new naval ships, to try and basically it was arms control, arms limitations to try and avoid war. He supports that, makes good economic sense in this time. However, a nationalist does not like that and will assassinate him. However, in this time period, things are going well enough with democracy that people are not going to say, hey, let's turn away from democracy. Instead, the government will continue to expand it. So, for example, in 1925, Japan will go and develop universal male suffrage. Previously, only a couple percent of Japanese people could vote. But now, all men, with a few exceptions, basically like criminals and people like that, are able to vote. Right? All men in 1925 in Japan are given the right to vote. That is a serious expansion of democracy. Doesn't include women, so the women will have to wait until after World War II. But you do see this massive expansion of democracy. And also, one thing I think is striking is there's going to be some recognition for the legality of unions. Unions will become legal. You can still be fired by a company for being a part of a union, but you can join a union, you can have a union, and that in and of itself is not a crime. So Japan in the late 1910s and 1920s, with some difficulties, is becoming more democratic, not less. While freedom, though, might be increasing in some ways, for example, men gaining the right to vote who had not held it before, there is also going to be some restrictions on these freedoms. The Japanese government wants to make sure that these men use the vote, from their perspective, responsibly, in a way that will ultimately support the emperor system. And what this means then, in terms of legislature, is in 1925, there will be a law passed called the Peace Preservation Law. Right? There's going to be a law passed called the Peace Preservation Law. This will make it illegal to form or participate in a group that denies a system of private property or tries to change our national essence. So in other words, if you belong to a group such as the communists or more radical socialists, that is now illegal. That is now illegal to be clearly to be a communist or to be a socialist, because they're denying private property. Change our national essence. This whole term that they use, national essence, literally Nihon Kokutai in Japanese, is very complex. But for our purposes, what it means is to change the emperor system. Right? So it's illegal to form or participate in a group that tries to change the system of private property, that is in a sense capitalism, or to move away from an emperor system. If you are part of this, you can go to jail for up to 10 years. So if you become a member of the Communist Party, you could go to jail for up to 10 years. And what I think is really striking is the Japanese government claimed jurisdiction outside of Japan. So if I'm Japanese and I go to France or the United States and become a communist there, and then I come back to Japan, they can arrest me and jail me for up to 10 years. Right? Usually you don't punish people for things they do in other countries. Right? That country punishes them according to its laws. But Japan's saying here, this is how serious we are. If you go to the United States, you become a communist, you come back to Japan, you're going to jail. So we can see that there's this attempt to make sure that people have a democratic choice, but one that will not fundamentally change the system. Now, one thing I have to emphasize, there is still choice. There are multiple political parties in Japan who are not socialist, who are not anarchist, who are not communist, who disagree with each other. So there is still a democracy. It's limited in important ways, but votes do matter. Right? This is still a democracy in which you don't have people just voting for a single party. There are multiple parties that are legal, that can legally participate and you can vote for, and who disagree with each other. So democracy still exists. It's just limited in a very important way. Right? They want to make sure that the democracy does bring in people, does allow for reform, does allow for change, but that will not lead to revolution. They want to make sure that the democracy does allow for reform, it does allow for change, it does give people a real choice, but that does not lead to revolution, right? You can make choices within certain parameters, but you can't change the whole system.